attorney and transportation advocate at MassBurg. And as Jonathan said, Phineas has been working for many years with US PERG, we're a federation, so he is mainly focused on federal work. If you like what he said, then it's because I improved it a little. If you don't like what he said, it's entirely his fault. Take from that. But, and I am no Phineas Baxendall. I do have to say he's if you have he would appreciate, I'm sure, if you follow up with him if you have questions, because he knows a lot more than I do, and he's a really fantastic resource for Massachusetts. He's now going to be at the Mass Budget and Policy Center. He's starting there next month. So we're very sorry to be losing him from PERG, but we know we'll continue to work with him. So do follow up with Phineas at Mass Budget and Policy Center in the future if you do have questions and you want to use him as a resource. So what he wrote was as follows. Federal transportation funding for highways and transit comes almost entirely from a transportation trust fund that receives its funding overwhelmingly from the federal gas tax. The federal gas tax has lost about 40% of its value since it was last increased in 1993. The value of gas tax revenues has further eroded due to increasing use of electric cars and the fewer miles driven by the millennial generation. For decades, Congress regularly passed 6-year transportation bills that allowed states and localities to plan around increased volumes of transportation funding. The last such long-term transportation act expired in 2009. Since then, congressional leaders have continually declared that it will now enact a new long-term transportation bill, but has failed to do so. Instead, Congress has improvised with over 30 short-term funding patches and a 2-year bill known as MAP 21 or MAP 21 that slightly adjusted the funding rules but failed to enact new revenue. Instead of new revenue, Congress has made do with federal stimulus funds and a series of budget gimmicks that technically provide an accounting of added money for the Transportation Trust Fund. Doing so has allowed the Transportation Trust Fund to meet its statutory obligations to the states and federal programs, even though gas tax revenues are no longer adequate to meet the approximately $50 billion in annual federal transportation fund outlays. The structural gap between revenues and outlays has grown to $16 billion annually. Congressional budget gimmicks to bridge this gap have been increasingly far-fetched. Last year, a major portion of the shortfall was accounted for by reassigning the way TSA fees collected at airports for security get accounted for. Funding to bridge the gap for the 2-year MAP 21 law in 2012 came largely from reducing the amount that corporate pension funds must hold in reserve for employees over the next 10 years. The official budget logic that was that fewer pension fund reserves will lead to 10 years of higher corporate profits, generating 10 years of higher future corporate income taxes, which will all count toward 2 years of funding, of transportation funding. Don't ask me about it. Ask me, not me. It's not clear whether Congress will continue to come up with new funding gimmicks to bridge the structural transportation deficit, especially given federal sequestration rules and Tea Party opposition to new funding. Despite several bills, some bipartisan, to increase the gas tax or introduce new kinds of fuel taxes, no long-term legislation has received support from congressional leadership or even the Obama administration. Transportation has so far avoided deep cuts because of the political myth that it remains a self-funding program through a separate transportation trust fund supported by the gas tax. If Congress rejects the next plea to, quote, rescue the highway fund with an additional money from the general fund, then outlays will be limited to revenue levels brought in through the gas tax, and large spending cuts will result. The only reason there has been no fiscal reckoning in recent years to address the structural deficit in transportation is because budgets have been passed with an 11th hour continuing resolutions that are based on the previous year's budget spending. In addition to across-the-board transportation cuts, an additional danger is that Congress could focus spending reductions specifically on public transit. Traditionally, the Federal Transit Administration has allocated approximately 20% of outlays from the, quote, highway fund, which provides all federal funding of surface transportation. Airports and maritime funding is separate. The 80-20 split in surface transportation funds remember, I want to reiterate, 80-20 split, is the result of an old, long-standing compromise that had been the political basis for this regular 6-year funding act. This political compromise has largely disintegrated. The only remaining broad consensus is a desire to avoid major highway cuts or gas tax hikes. Some Republicans have called for targeting transit cuts as a way to get highway fund spending within its means by focusing on its core mission. They attempt to deflect discussion about the inadequacy of the current gas tax by focusing on the need to end diversions of the highway fund toward non-highway programs such as transit, biking, and pedestrian infrastructure. Other transit opponents claim that the rise of Uber and Lyft or the coming of self-driving cars will make transit obsolete. Back in 2009, the Republican-led House of Representatives nearly passed a bill that would have eliminated transit funding from the Transportation Trust Fund and required transit to instead rely on yearly allocations from general revenues. Without a dedicated funding source, this would have been devastating for public transit, especially because so much of transit ridership occurs in only a handful of states. That bill was defeated largely because transit supporters successfully exerted pressure on a group of moderate urban Republicans, a contingent that barely still exists in Congress. Gridlock has paradoxically been a friend to transit funding in recent years. With the current political alignment, a major overhaul of surface transportation funding would almost certainly reduce transit funding. The best chance of maintaining existing levels of transit funding in a major transportation overhaul would come from progressive filibuster threats in the Senate, or if enough Tea Party Republicans refuse to go along with new funding, urban Democratic votes that were necessary to pass a budget. While it's not possible to predict whether federal transit cuts lie ahead, Massachusetts discussions about future funding for transportation clearly shouldn't count on additional federal revenues. So pretty much what Josh said earlier is a no presence under any tree or in any other deliverable form for the future.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Luckily, okay, we'll have them back for a follow-up conference. Kathy?
Good morning, thanks for coming. I'm Kathy Buckley, and I am here representing, I'm chair of the Massachusetts Sierra Club, also active. Jack Spence is the chair of the 350 Mass Transportation Working Group, and I've also worked with that group. My actual career was in transportation planning. I worked for the Boston Metropolitan Planning Organization for a few decades, so I was in the transportation building. At any rate, I got involved in climate issues towards the end of my career, became very, very terrified actually of what I was reading, and tried to push from within to get transportation department to be more active towards climate. Was quite unsuccessful and decided to leave and become a climate activist. So here I am. For those of you who haven't studied climate a lot, it really is a terrifying situation. The possibilities of our losing are almost beyond our, I mean, what would happen if we lost were almost beyond our imagination. So it's hard for people like me who've studied it to talk to people who haven't, because it's kind of like otherworldly. But you know, just looking at Hurricane Patricia with wind speeds over 200 miles per hour, one of the leading scientists studying climate change, James Hansen, has said that that's his major concern, that the storms are going to become so powerful, you know, unlike anything we've ever seen. My son was born in 1989. Hurricane Hugo that year was the most destructive storm ever in the history of the United States. It is no longer in the top 10. So moving on to more cheerful transportation. About a third of the transportation, about a third of those greenhouse gases that are creating these problems for us come from transportation. We have the Massachusetts Global Solutions Act that's going to make everything better, but of course we have to adhere to it. And the Transportation Department in particular has been singled out as not really doing that. Their plan is to triple ridership on the T, or in public transportation in general, plus triple walking and triple bicycling. If that sounds more like a slogan than a plan, I agree with you. I think what we need to do is a major reexamination. Those of you who are old enough remember the Boston Transportation Planning Review of the early 70s. Governor Sargent had the guts and the wisdom to say, wait a minute, I hear you folks from Roxbury and Jamaica Plain and Cambridge and Somerville. We do have to decide if we're going in the right direction, because at that time we were building I-95 right through Falmouth in Milton, connecting to an inner belt that was going to go blasting through Cambridge and Somerville and just continue right up north, because that's what we did back in those days. So we changed all that. Those roads were stopped. We have intact neighborhoods still, and we also got some transit improvements because we went to Washington and changed the rules. So we need to do that. There's lots of big projects and there's lots of little things. For example, the Sierra Club, a lot of the activists with the Sierra Club have been working on a north-south rail link. When I first heard about that, it was kind of like, okay, you want to go from Washington, D.C. to Portland? Okay, but that's a lot of money to get you there. Why don't you just take the orange line from Back Bay to North Station and you'll be fine. But actually, that's kind of peripheral part of it. It's really about getting people from the North Shore to jobs in Boston, and we can increase transit ridership by over 50,000 because the jobs are closer to South Station and Back Bay, not North Station. But that's an expensive project. There's a 10-year lag. How does that compare to the extension of the Green Line? How does that compare to improving the headways on the subway lines by a factor of 2? All of these things have to be looked at all together. So if we could step back and say, okay, what are we going to do and how do we do it? And how do we pay for it? We're going to have cars that are becoming more electric. That's a terrific thing in terms of climate. But that's going to mean less gas tax because we're not going to be buying as much gas. How do we do that? We could charge the vehicle miles traveled, or we could, like every year we get a car inspected, our mileage goes in, we know how much people drive. You pay more if you drive more. Our insurance could also be tagged that way. We mostly want to keep people out of single occupant vehicles, especially when they're gasoline driven. And even if they're electric, if our electric system is 65% natural gas, and by the way, natural gas is not a bridge to the future, it's actually quite bad because there's so much methane leakage, and methane is 86 times worse than carbon dioxide. But there's a really elegant solution. It's called the price on carbon. And there's a hearing next Tuesday at 1 o'clock. You can make it, please come. Room B1. It's an elegant solution because we're basically going to pay more for the carbon that we use. So that means the gas tax will go up and other taxes, the price, the fee. It's not a tax. You know why? Because it's going to be either revenue neutral, meaning all of it comes back to us, or almost revenue neutral. There are two bills. One is all of the money comes back to us, and the other one is 80% comes back to us, and then 20% is spent on things including public transportation. That means that if you're an MBTA rider, you're actually going to make money on this deal. That means if you keep your thermostat low, you're going to make money on this deal. So it's a good thing, I think. And we'd be the first state to do it, if we do it. I just want to mention one other issue, which is the debt that the MBTA has. There was a lot of talk about Greece not too long ago, and they pay 15% of their gross domestic product on debt and interest and principal, 15%. And the International Monetary Fund said that is absolutely you cannot do it. It's just way too high. Well, guess what it is for the MBTA? It's 31%. So no wonder we have a problem. This came about, there was a lot of switching around going on with the big dig, and a lot of this came up at that time. I won't get into the details of that. But just to say that we have to also look at revenue. How do we really pay for this system that has so much good benefit, and that we can't put it on the backs of the people who are using it, because we tend to be lower income folks using the using the MBTA and other RTA systems. So we really have to step back and say, what do we want to build, and how do we want to pay for it?
Thanks.
I think that was a very good segue because I'm going to be focusing on low income. My name is Concetta Paul. I am part of a group called Save Our Section 8, which was formed after the sequester cuts and the federal government was going to chop off subsidies to public housing, and Boston Housing was going to lay off 400 families from voucher holders. We're just going to chop voucher holding families. So we formed a group, and I am also affiliated with Michael Caine, and most of you know Michael Caine. I sit on the board of his organization. I am a journalist by profession, have been most of my life, and I live in South Boston. So I am going to be trying to make a linkage, which there is of course, between transportation and housing, but especially low-income housing. And the figures that I have, I do not have the kind of background and knowledge base that most people, nearly everyone in this room has. So, but I have very strong opinions about nearly everything. So I went, so you know, most of my information, because I don't like to plagiarize, is from the internet. I did some research and I have taken some stuff from off the internet. So if you're a public housing resident, how dependent are you on public transportation? So we know that HUD, as you know, Department of Housing and Urban Development, oversees public housing, and HUD uses the 2014 median income for Boston, which is $94,000, to calculate housing affordability for Boston. The median income for Massachusetts, I believe, is about $87,000. So here are some of HUD's income guidelines for Boston as it relates to affordability for public housing. A family is considered low income at 80% of median. If you're a one-person household and you're earning $47,000 or less, you are considered low income. If you're a three-person household earning $61,000 or below, you are considered low income. Very low income, 50% of median. A one-person household earning $32,000. Very low income. For a three-person household, that would be $42,000. Extremely low income, ELI, 30% of median. A one-person household earning $20,000, extremely low income. A three-person household earning $25,000. And I rounded up the figures, it's actually $25,450, but I don't want to give all these little bits. So $25,000 is considered extremely low income. Let's see how public housing residents in Boston measure up in terms of income. So I got some figures from the Boston Housing Authority. And nearly 1,000 BHA households report no income. Actually, the Boston Housing figures said have no income, but I substitute report no income. Because we know there's a little fudging. But anyway, nearly 2,000, and Boston Housing has about 25,000 households. Nearly 2,000 households report incomes ranging from $1,000 to $5,000. That's a year. Nearly 5,000 households report incomes ranging from $5,000 a year to $10,000 a year. About 8,000 households report incomes ranging from $10,000 to $15,000. So if we add all this up, that's about 3/5 of all BHA households report incomes of $15,000 or less a year living here in Boston, Massachusetts. About 3,000 BHA households report incomes ranging from $15,000 to $20,000. So far, nearly 4/5 of all BHA households report incomes of less than $20,000 a year. For the remaining households, nearly 2,000 report incomes ranging from 20 to 25. Roughly 1,000 report incomes from 25 to 30, and just 3,000 BHA households report earnings of $30,000 and over. 1/5 of all BHA households report incomes of $20,000 or more. Okay? So although people fudge these figures are basically enough to go by, because BHAs, they do the reporting, they check with the IRS, they do all the welfare programs, so it's basically a good enough benchmark. Okay? Now, in South Boston where I live, there are 5 public housing complexes. We have 3 family developments, I don't know if you've heard of them, Old Colony, West Broadway, and Mariel and McCormick. and 2 elderly disabled ones, West 9 and L Street. So how dependent are these residents on public housing? Again, I used HUD. HUD has a transportation cost calculator, affordability indexes, and all the rest of it. I used the transportation cost calculator, and I based it on a 3-person household in South Boston with 1 commuting adult, let's say a family, 1 adult, 2 kids, earning $25,000 a year. And I asked Boston Housing, for such a family, how much would the person pay in rent? And they made a calculation. They said the person would pay about $600 in rent. So I said, what if you own 1 vehicle? And I used a 2012 Toyota Corolla because I couldn't use a BMW. Although I see some parked outside, but anyway. You know? So that person would spend about $12,000 on housing and transportation. And it was broken down as this: $7,200 for housing, which is correct, which works out to 28% of income, because we know public housing is about 30% of income. For transportation, with the vehicle usage costs, which they calculate, would be about $1,200, and ownership costs would be about $3,000. So that person would pay about $4,000 for transportation, which is 18% of income. And therefore, if that family only used public housing, based on a $75 pass a month, and I didn't factor in the kids, I'm assuming the kids are young and they don't have to pay the tea. Okay, so that person would spend like $900 a year on transportation, as opposed to $4,000 if that person owned the car. Okay, and if that person owned the car and was also using the T, then it goes high. Okay, now I looked at something called location efficient housing, and another buzzword, transit oriented development. And I'm going to start quoting from stuff I took offline. I looked at a 2011 paper which is titled Getting Home, Transportation Equity and Access to Affordable Housing. And it's by a group called the Leadership Conference Education Fund. And according to them, and some other people mentioned that as well, renters and home buyers looking for affordable housing are often pushed into far-flung areas, okay, like Brockton and Fall River and other places, which is happening in Boston right now, with higher transportation costs. So it drives up the overall cost of living for this family, and people have mentioned that. Transportation costs as a percentage of total household income, it ranges from 9% for a high income household to 55% or more for very low income households. When families seek affordable housing, like lower rents and mortgages in the suburbs, which is happening in Boston right now because of gentrification, people mention that as well, their transportation costs go up. In the nation's 28 largest cities, working families spend about 57% of their incomes on housing and transportation, with roughly 29% of income going to transportation. Other people mention this next point as well. After decades of growing sprawl, American planning practices have been re-evaluated. So now environmental advocates want to reduce traffic-related emissions, disability advocates want accessibility, home buyers no longer want to spend hours on commutes. So the push now is for, mention that as well, higher density, mixed use, mixed income, integrated communities planned around public transit. To ensure that transportation investments do not simply displace low-income people in cities to transit-deficient areas where rents remain low, policymakers must build in mechanisms to preserve affordable housing near transit. We have here a place called Fruitvale, okay, which is missing some, what am I missing? Oh, okay. So I end with a look at the Fruitvale Transit Village project in California. It's a $100 million mixed-use development. It is next to the Bay Area Rapid Transit, they call it BART station in Oakland. When Fruitvale is predominantly minority, it has a low income, economically depressed. When the transit agency there they ran into strong opposition because they wanted to build a parking garage next to a T station. I call it T, to the Fruitvale station. But the community rose up and said, no way. So the Transit Authority withdrew its proposal. It agreed to work with the local council, that's a CDC, a Community Development Corporation, and other stakeholders. And so they came up with a new proposal. And the new proposal called for a mixture of housing, shops, offices, a library, childcare, a pedestrian plaza, and other community services, but it was all surrounding the transit station. And here's the conclusion they found, that the Fruitvale Transit Village, and that was proposed in 2011, so it's up and running now, it illustrates a number of key themes and effective practices that are central to incorporating the principles of environmental justice into transportation planning and design. Number one, it demonstrates an effective use of partnerships to generate funding and other resources necessary to plan and implement a costly, complex project. But it also illustrates a strong commitment to public involvement by the lead agencies. Because the local CDCs and everybody else here, okay, the leadership role that people like this play in projects, this back in Fruitvale helped to ensure that it was the community's own vision, the community's vision for the transit station and its surrounding area that became the guiding principles for the planning and design process. And lastly, that the planning effort behind the Fruitvale Transit Village, it represents an innovative strategy for using mass transit as a lever for revitalizing an urban community, okay? And just to end, I'm ending here to say that our region, the Northeast, leads the nation in public transportation use. According to the US Census, 32% of households in the Northeast use public transportation. And in all 4 regions of America, most commuters use the bus. 67% took the bus, 51% took subways and trolleys, 19% took commuter intercity rail, like the commuter rail, and just 7% took the shuttle vans that we were talking about. And for Boston, the census figures for 2013 remain consistent with the figures for 2010, and it showed that out of 465,000 renter-occupied units in Boston, 97,000 are below poverty. 305,000 of those rental households used public transportation, and 65% of them are below poverty. 217,000 households use the bus, 228,000 use the train. Half of these households depended on public transportation to get to work or to school all or most of the time. So in every demographic, nearly 300,000 of these households, from Black, Hispanic, and elderly, they had access to public transit to go to the grocery store, for personal services, for retail shopping, for entertainment, for health, and for personal banking. So how much do low-income people depend on public transport?